Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone. I'm Patrick Chiglav-Cannon, Research Assistant here at the Council on Geostrategy. It is my pleasure to host today's event, organised by the Council on Geostrategy, the newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London and dedicated to making the United Kingdom, as well as other free and open nations, more united, stronger and greener. This event is intended to celebrate and discuss the publication of our talented Associate Fellow, Dr Alexander Lanoszka's book, Military Alliances in the 21st Century. Military Alliances in the 21st Century is the first book to explore fully the politics that shape these security arrangements, from their initial formation through to the various challenges that test them and sometimes lead to their demise. Across 6 thematic chapters, Dr. Lanoszka challenges conventional wisdom that has dominated our understanding of how military alliances have operated historically and into the present. Although military alliances today may seem uniquely hobbled by their internal difficulties, Dr. Lanoszka argues that they are in fact, by their very nature, prone to dysfunction. This book provides a starting point for wider discussion about the suitability of military alliances in today's geopolitical climate and how they can be improved. The renewed Russian assault on Ukraine has reinvigorated European security concerns and prompted nations to reevaluate their involvement and commitment to existing alliances and where they perhaps need to be expanded. It has also raised questions about their validity and what form they may take and role they may serve in the future. And today, we will hear key insights on these issues and more from Dr. Alexander Lanoszka, Dr. Hillary Briffa, and James Rogers. I'll now just briefly introduce each of our panelists. Dr. Alexander Lanoszka is the author of Military Alliances in the 21st Century. He is also an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and the Baxley College of International Affairs in Waterloo, Canada. He has previously taught at City, University of London, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Dickey Centre for International Understanding at Dartmouth College and at Stanton Nuclear Security, postdoctoral fellow at MIT's Security Studies program. Dr. Lanoszka has worked for the United States Department of Defense and as consultant for Global Affairs Canada. He holds a PhD in philosophy and an MA in politics, both from Princeton University. Dr. Hillary Briffa is lecturer in National Security Studies and the Assistant Director of the Centre for Defence Studies at King's College London, where she read for a PhD in War Studies, asking whether small states can have a grand strategy. In the Department of War Studies, Hillary is the research-themed lead for national and international security in the School of Security Studies. She currently teaches national security studies and political violence, counterterrorism, and human rights at MA level. James Rogers is the co-founder and director of research here at the Council on Geostrategy. James held positions at the Henry Jackson Society, the Baltic Defence College, and the European Union Institute for Security Studies. He's been invited to give oral evidence at the Foreign Affairs, Defence, and International Development Committees in the Houses of Parliament. He holds an MPhil in Contemporary European Studies from the University of Cambridge and an award-winning BSc in International Politics and Strategic Studies from the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. Before we start, I'll just lay out a couple housekeeping rules. Our panelists will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and in the second half of our hour, we'll move to a Q&A session from the audience. Dr. Lanoszka will start with his speech, followed by Dr. Briffa, and then James Rogers. Finally, the event will end with a Q&A session. You can ask questions during the whole course of the event, but please make sure to indicate your name, affiliation, and to whom you are addressing the question. So, without any further delay, Mr. Lanoszka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak with you today about my book, Military Alliances in the 21st Century. Now, the provocation that frames this event is the deceptively simple question: are military alliances ready for geopolitical competition? And at first blush, it seems like military alliances, which I define as those security arrangements that involve 2 or more states and are based on formal treaties, have run their course. Those that currently exist seem to have innumerable problems that call perhaps for alternative arrangements with respect to security cooperation. For some, NATO seems to be very bloated, such that its diverse and large membership makes it a very unreliable or inflexible tool of statecraft. The US-South Korea military alliance is under considerable strain, given how South Korean citizens and elites appear to want more and more autonomy from the United States, not least because they have different attitudes about how to handle China, or for that matter, North Korea. The security treaty between Japan and the United States has also come under question in the last decade over doubts about whether the United States would help defend Japan's outlying islands. And indeed, the news headlines over the past few years suggests that our alliances are too dysfunctional, too obsolete, so as not to be worth maintaining. And perhaps as a result of this dissatisfaction with military alliances, we are now seeing a proliferation of so-called plurilateral or minilateral initiatives like AUKUS, the British, Polish, Ukrainian Trilateral Initiative, and the Quadrilateral that comprises Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. They may not be proper alliances as such, but they do seem to provide an alternative, more elastic form of security cooperation that is perhaps better suited to tackling contemporary challenges. Now, one aim of my book is to argue that whether we like it or not, alliance politics is indeed the meat of international relations. So much turns on the promises that states make to one another in order to provide seemingly military aid to others. Yet the basic conundrum is that those promises often do not seem very believable, in part because making those promises in peacetime is always cheaper than expending blood and treasure on behalf of others in wartime. And so what I argue in my book is that dysfunction is a persistent feature, not necessarily a bug, in alliance politics. That these organizations have always been and always will be extraordinarily difficult to manage, no matter how well-intentioned its leaders may be towards one another. Friction is unavoidable because alliances often involve countries that vary in their threat assessments, in their capabilities, and in their foreign policy priorities. And gaps in beliefs about future war, as well as in expectations about who will show up and how, are inevitable and persistent. Of course, I didn't write a book that simply says that international politics is complicated, that the world is complicated, and as such, alliances are complicated too. After all, in the last 30 or so years, we have seen a large body of scholarship produced that builds upon new theoretical concepts, greater access to diplomatic archives, various cutting-edge methodological tools and techniques, and greater sensitivity to real-world policy concerns. And yet, I found that, at least a few years ago when I started writing this book, that we don't really have a book that tries to put all the pieces of alliance politics in one place. In fact, the one book that tries to do so was Glenn Snyder's Alliance Politics, written in the late 1990s. And indeed, that was a book where the case evidence is primarily drawn from the pre-1914 world. It's an excellent book, but it's one that's also very difficult to digest. And as such, I think it behooved us to understand how much and what sort of knowledge have been accumulated about military alliances, and for me as an academic, to try to communicate that knowledge to a broader public. So modestly, therefore, my goal has been to synthesize the state of the art with respect to our own understandings about how alliances operate, to offer new arguments about their very operation, and hopefully to inspire future research. I will let, of course, readers decide as to whether I am successful or not. And so I framed the book around key pieces of conventional wisdom about military alliances. Now, of course, I say that these are pieces of conventional wisdom. Not everyone subscribes to these pieces of conventional wisdom. Of course, there are going to be disagreements. Nevertheless, these pieces of conventional wisdom are as follows: that alliances form to balance power or to gain influence over others, that allies face an intractable dilemma whereby too little commitment alienates allies, but too much commitment might overly empower them into doing harmful things, that in alliances, states must bear their fair share of the defense burden, that military alliances aggregate capabilities and thus allow their members to fight far more effectively than what otherwise would be the case, and that alliances only last as long as the reason that springs them into existence. What I do in the book is to organize chapters around those pieces of conventional wisdom so as to explore the politics of alliances across their lifespan, from their initiation and formation all the way through their eventual termination. Suffice it to say, there's some kernel of truth in each of these pieces of conventional wisdom, but I would argue that they're at best misleading. For example, alliances may very well result from a want to balance power or to gain influence over others, But left unexplained here is why states take the time to write up treaties that formalize their relationship. And I argue that these treaties are extraordinarily important, both for defining alliances, but also for understanding them in the first place. States do have to consider the challenges posed by offering too much or too little commitment to others. But these challenges are not as intractable as often made out to be the case, since states actually have a wide array of tools for dealing with these problems. States do, want to see their counterparts take defense spending seriously, but the relationship between military expenditures and the defense burden, or collective defense for that matter, is hardly ever linear, especially when nuclear weapons might reduce the likelihood of major power war. It may indeed be better to fight alongside with allies than without, but fighting alongside those allies remains extraordinarily difficult, considering, again, the different interests, the different capabilities, and the different foreign policy priorities that those allies often have. And allies come to an end for all sorts of reasons, some of which have nothing at all to do with the reasons that sprung them into existence. Now, I'm only going to tease the main claims here. After all, if I say too much, then there'll be little point in reading the book, but those are basically the bullet points of the arguments that I advance in the book. So excuse me for being a little bit elliptical, but the punchline that I want to deliver here is that alliances are very complicated creatures in international politics. They always have been, they always will be. They're an inevitable part of geopolitical competition, and they're always going to be tough to manage. And so what I hope to get across in this book is that for all the hand-wringing about how difficult it seems alliances appear to be in terms of tools of statecraft, they have always been that way. Leaders have found military alliances to be exasperating vehicles of security cooperation in the 1910s, the 1950s, the 1980s, and of course, into our contemporary era. So with all that, I would look forward to hearing from Hillary and James, as well as getting your questions and comments in the Q&A. Thank you so much for organizing this event, Patrick and others. I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lanoszka. I will now hand it over to Dr. Briffa.
Hey, thank you so much. Well, thanks for the kind invitation to participate in this webinar. It's my first contribution as an associate fellow of the Council on Geostrategy, so I'm really happy to be here. I'll start by congratulating Dr. Lanoszka on the launch of this very excellent and timely and very readable book. So thank you so much for the copy. I really enjoyed it, and I'll just show it to everybody online so they can go out and know what cover to look for. Most of the case studies in this book is from the US perspective, and Dr. Lanoszka explains why he uses that as a framework. So I thought what I could offer is using my allotted time to demonstrate the broader applicability of the lessons and perhaps some areas where the options are either a bit more limited when it comes to reflecting upon the dilemmas and questions raised in this book as applied to small states in the international system, which is my area of expertise. And so in the interest of time, I'll raise 3 points based on half of the 6 themes in the book. And then I'm happy to pick up on other issues in the discussion. So I'm going to share my screen because I've got just 3 pictures that I also want to show if it's possible. If it's not possible, then I'll just leave it. I don't think I can. Yes. Okay. No, it's not possible, but it's fine. I just wanted to show some pictures, but it doesn't matter. I'll put them in the chat afterwards. Okay. So I'll just cut to it. So the first theme that I wanted to pick up on and that Dr. Lanoszka just spoke about in his introduction is why states establish military alliances. And Dr. Lanoszka challenges the conventional wisdom that states form alliances to balance power and or to gain influence over other states. And he argues in the book that some scholars sometimes overclaim this to be the case. And I found those arguments very compelling because in particular how they apply to medium and large states, because these often have the agency to engage bilaterally and to actually take the lead in forging these kinds of alliances. But when it comes to small states, as the literature has developed, we find that scholars such as Baldur Thorhallsson from the University of Iceland and others have actually turned away from the idea of military alliances for the purpose of balancing or bandwagoning altogether. They argue that alliance theorists are explaining the actions of great powers when they use this kind of approach, whereas the behavior of small states may stem from more complex considerations and more nuanced alliance motivations than are captured by balancing or bandwagoning. And they actually call it instead alliance shelter, which they say is much more accurate in explaining how small states align. And so I thought I'd offer a little bit on shelter-seeking theory for small states as an explanation of why perhaps alliances endure despite all the problems justly outlined in this book. So it might be something to consider for future work. And essentially, the idea is that by joining a military alliance, small states not only gain security protection, but they also gain access to that shelter that is political, so military and also diplomatic, that might include international norms and international law, economic shelter, and societal shelter, which refers to access to knowledge and innovation and information that is not indigenous to that state. And this is not necessarily in order to overcome just external vulnerabilities, but to compensate for intrinsic domestic limitations that might be in infrastructure, knowledge, and administrative capacity. And so if you look at the work of people like Dr. Anders Wevel from the University of Copenhagen, he explains that the benefits of shelter-seeking behavior are that it allows small states to seek refuge from the great power politics of international anarchy by allying with at least one or more strong states that are able and willing to shelter small states from external threats. And so, for example, we might look, and now I can actually share my screen to show you the picture I wanted to show you. We might look at the case of Estonia, where NATO has actually provided Estonia with shelter since it joined in 2004, together with its Baltic neighbors, because it had these ongoing concerns about aggression from neighboring Russia. And now today we're seeing very similar discussions playing out with regards to Finland and Sweden in relation to NATO. And I actually think this is one of the most significant geopolitical outcomes of the current Ukrainian crisis, because historically for small states that are located in the vicinity of hostile neighbors or rising regional powers, it's been neutrality that's been the most attractive option, and rarely actually joining military alliances that might make them susceptible to threats. And Finland is a prime example because its strategic calculus is influenced by this long history of insecurity on the border of this enormous and dangerous and dominating neighbor on one side, and then the global hegemon on the other. And so by going for this policy of neutrality and military non-alignment, Finland's retained its room for maneuver without alienating Russia. And yet the Ukraine crisis has forced this extremely rapid reassessment of Finland's security calculus. And it's now viewing alliance shelter as the more secure long-term option today. So I thought I'd put this cartoon to show it in visual form. And so one last thing I wanted to add on this point is that the book focuses on quite a narrow definition of military alliances, but I still wanted to note that we might see similar discussions to the ones animating the discussion about potentially joining NATO. We might see similar ideas emerging in the European Union for neutral countries because of the permanent structured cooperation in defense, which is called PESCO, that was instituted in 2017. Now, at the moment, the security shelter afforded by the EU treaty actually grants neutral countries like Malta the certainty that if military security is required, other EU countries will be bound to help her because of the solidarity clause. But as the EU continues to move towards deeper security cooperation, it might become increasingly difficult for neutral countries like Malta to remain strategically neutral in a way that is still compatible with EU security sheltering benefits. So I think we're seeing these tensions emerging in international groupings. My other two two points are much shorter, so I'll just raise them quickly in the interest of time. And that's the second theme of the book, is the issue of entrapment. And I think the concerns about this were never more evident than last January, when we saw in the US, President Joe Biden said in a press conference, I put the quote up there, that Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and what not to do. And the next day, without naming any names, President Zelensky tweeted that we want to remind the great powers that there are no minor incursions and small nations, just as there are no minor casualties and little grief from the loss of loved ones. I say this as the president of a great power. Now, theoretically, in international law, there shouldn't be a distinction between sovereign states, right? But in practice, if we contrast Biden's concerns and Zelensky's expectations, this really demonstrates how the relationship between asymmetric partners has to be realistic about how much and where they're willing to commit themselves when push comes to shove and red lines are crossed. And I think this is the idea of pragmatic expectations is a theme that really emerges in the book. And so finally, the last point I wanted to raise was about the theme in the book of burden sharing controversies related to alliances, especially the debates about whether members of US alliances have to do more to bear their fair share of the common defense burden. And I really appreciated the more nuanced approach in the book, which challenges defense spending as an evaluative metric for contributions. I think too much of our conversation on this subject basically revolves around accusing small states of free riding or benefiting from shelter without giving back, mainly because of the rhetoric around President Trump's real vehemence on this issue. And of course, an alliance will offer benefits at a lower cost, right? Small states can pool resources, the relationships between states have greater predictability and formality, and this disproportionately favors smaller actors. But even with these accusations of free riding, we forget that for larger actors in the alliance, they're also benefiting, right? They're getting greater legitimacy in their actions, access to other types of resources, such as bases in important geographical locations, indigenous knowledge and skills in unfamiliar terrain, and kind of all these things that Zartman once called resources through will and skill. And I put on this slide an example of Estonia's innovation in cybersecurity and hosting of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn, because I basically want to make the case that small states can serve as laboratories of innovation whose successful experiments can then be scaled up. And so we really need a more diversified understanding of what burden sharing actually means. So to conclude, in these 10 minutes, I've tried to make the case that military alliances should be thought of for small actors as a source of political, economic, and societal shelter, that we need to be more realistic about the assistance we genuinely expect to give or receive from others, and that the benefits small states offer to alliances go beyond numbers on a defense spending balance sheet. So I'll stop there for now, but congratulations again, Dr. Lanoszka. I really enjoyed the book and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Briffa. That was a very good insight into the alliance politics of smaller states. I will now hand it over to James Rogers, but before I do that, I'll just remind everyone that the Q&A box is open, and in asking a question, please state your name and affiliation. James, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and also to Alexander and Hillary for those really interesting interventions, as well as the introduction to Alexander's book, which you should all buy and read if you haven't already. I want to use my 5 to 7 minutes to talk a bit about the UK's interest in relation to alliances, and also to expand out of that a bit and look at the integrated review and some of the innovations that has in relation to alliances, and also more broadly, I think, to what are called plurilateral arrangements or minilateral groupings. I thought I'd just remind everyone at the beginning that the UK is really only party to one formal alliance, and that is, of course, NATO. But even there, we need to remember that the treaty guarantee under Article 5 doesn't necessarily commit the UK to an automatic, or any other ally for that matter, to an automatic military response if another ally comes under an armed attack within the North Atlantic area. And that's an important thing to remember. And we'll come on to what that means in a little while. The UK is also perhaps party to what we might call a quasi-alliance in the form of the five-power defence arrangements. Now, this doesn't include any kind of commitment to defend the other four powers within the five-power defence arrangements, that's to say Australia, Malaysia, New Zealand and Singapore, in the event that they come under an armed attack. But it does commit the UK to consult with the other four powers in the event that an armed attack occurs on the Malay Peninsula. But it does not, as I said, involve any kind of military response. In addition, there are a number of countries which host British migrants, have historical connections to the UK, and in which the UK has quite intense strategic interests. These include, of course, the Republic of Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, but perhaps also Japan, Oman, Bahrain, and Kenya. It would be hard to imagine the UK would not provide military support to them if they or the British military facilities within them came under attack. Even though the UK would not be obligated to help under any form of treaty mechanism. Indeed, Sweden and Finland might also be included here. After all, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, said only yesterday that it would be, and I quote, inconceivable that the UK would not help them if they did come under attack, particularly if they were to join NATO in the interim until they achieve full membership. I think that it's really important to point out at this stage that though many alliances exist, and the US has many bilateral alliances with a number of different countries, which Alexander has already mentioned, NATO is quite a unique alliance insofar as it binds together most of the countries of the Euro-Atlantic area. It places much of this region under an Anglo-American defence guarantee, which is then actualised through British and American forwardly deployed conventional forces. During the Cold War, this is why the US and the UK maintained large garrisons in permanent bases in West Germany, which was, of course, at the time the most frontline state. Both countries are faithfully committed to themselves to upholding NATO to the extent that it forms the bedrock of the prevailing international order, providing shelter, which is something that Hillary was just talking about, for all the countries that exist inside, some of which might have succumbed to predatory activities from both without and from within if the alliance had not been created. Now, despite many years of concern, things relating to burden sharing, the rise of Donald Trump, Brexit, and the various tilts and pivots of the US, and to a lesser extent, perhaps the UK, NATO has proven again and again that it has the resilience and I think the ambition to fulfill its mission. Save for some ambiguity of some allies, Russia's intensified aggression since 2014 has met with a robust response. New sanctions have been applied by NATO allies. Deterrence has been enhanced with the enhanced and tailored forward presences in the Baltic and Black Sea regions. And shipments of financial and military assistance have also been given to Ukraine, despite it being itself not a NATO ally. The alliance has also told Finland and Sweden that they would probably be granted very fast-track membership of NATO if or when they decide to join. However, not everything is rosy. The problem here is that the geopolitical environment that gave rise to the alliance and gave it its traction is changing. As Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, stated in her speech at the Mansion House last week, security in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific is increasingly connected and even indivisible. This point was also reiterated this morning by both Boris Johnson and also Fumio Kishida, the Japanese Prime Minister, during their consultations. The point here is that the two regions, the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, are folding into one another. And more importantly, perhaps, the Indo-Pacific is rising increasingly in geo-economic and geopolitical prominence, to the extent that the Euro-Atlantic is no longer as relatively central as it was when NATO was created, or indeed enlarged during the 1990s and 2000s. NATO also has little role outside of the North Atlantic area, at least in any treaty sense. So this does not mean that our alliances are no longer suitable for a more geopolitical or competitive age. What it does mean, I think, is that we need to think more creatively about generating something like the geostrategic impact that NATO has had in the Euro-Atlantic, but also in the Indo-Pacific. However, it's important to note that in the Indo-Pacific, a NATO-like edifice is extremely unlikely. There are many reasons for this. For example, there is no great threat to the extent that there was with the formation or the expansion of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. There is no knowledge among the strategic elites within the Indo-Pacific and indeed the Euro-Atlantic of the impact that a war of the scale of the Second World War actually has. And perhaps there's no interest as well in actual ordering in the region, the existence and establishment of the quadrilateral security dialogue notwithstanding. Here, I think, similarly to its role in constructing NATO and then enlarging it after the USSR's collapse, the UK has been leading a kind of conceptual reappraisal of multilateralism, of which, of course, NATO is a key part. For example, the integrated review that the government published last year argues that the old rules-based international system, as it was called, is breaking down. And it is breaking down because of the intensified geopolitical competition that I mentioned earlier, but also the rise of the Indo-Pacific to international prominence. In this new environment, it says we need to uphold an open international order. And that's why I think it's right to think of NATO as a kind of global center of gravity. But insofar as we could do that, we also need to think about new relations which bind NATO and non-NATO states together. In many respects, we've already done this in Europe. We've done this through the Joint Expeditionary Force, which binds together countries like Finland and Sweden, at the moment non-NATO members, with a number of NATO members such as the UK, Poland, and Norway. We've also done it more recently with AUKUS, which binds the UK, the US, and Australia together, with the Trilateral, which binds the UK, Poland, and Ukraine together, and also in a bilateral context with enhanced relations with Japan, which I mentioned earlier. Some have called this a kind of quasi-alliance in the making. That might be a little too extreme, but nonetheless, it gets to grips with the idea that there are fundamental interests that certain countries have, and it makes sense to bind them together further still. So insofar as a NATO-like alliance in the Indo-Pacific is unlikely, these plurilateral initiatives bind like-minded states together in support of an open international order. In addition, they act to dissuade or deter revisionist powers being countries like Russia, which have annexed parts of other countries, their near neighbors, or countries like China, which have constructed a number of islands in the South China Sea in an attempt to claim the sea itself. So contemporary military alliances for Britain, NATO, are ready for geopolitical competition. They're ready for geopolitical competition in and around Europe. But they need to be complemented by new plurilateral initiatives which reach into the Indo-Pacific insofar as that region is increasingly important. So I think this opens up a broader discussion to be had, not only about military alliances themselves, but also about a number of additional types of international framework that might have the same kind of impact that a military alliance can have, but realized through a different context. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So we will now move on to the Q&A session. And I will begin by asking one to all the panelists from myself, which sort of follows on from what James was just talking about. Has the continued expansion of security cooperation between like-minded nations and the formation of plurilateral initiatives like the Quad replaced and/or discouraged the formation of military alliances as defined by Dr. Lanoszka in the book as arrangements made between two or more sovereign states on the basis of a written treaty that serves to coordinate military policy towards at least one common goal? Sorry, a bit of a mouthy definition there.
Hillary, do you have thoughts here? Or I know James kind of already given his answer, his remarks, but.
I'm sorry, my connection froze exactly as Patrick read out the question. Sorry, could you repeat it, Patrick? It's the dangers of university Wi-Fi.
Sure. So I was asking whether the expansion of security cooperation between like-minded nations and the formation of plurilateral initiatives like the Quad have either replaced or discouraged the formation of military alliances as defined in the book as arrangements made between two or more sovereign states on the basis of a written treaty that serves to coordinate military policies to this one common goal.
Yeah, I'll share one thought and I'll pass it over to Dr. Lanoszka. I don't think they're replacing. I think we're seeing a shift in the focus. So one thing that because of the narrow definition in the book, which focuses on written treaties for military action to use kinetic or lethal force, is how it's phrased in the book. That's quite a very specific approach. But actually, we see that a lot of these military alliances aren't just engaging in kinetic operations, but actually, what about disaster relief in the Pacific? What about search and rescue in the Mediterranean? I know I said I'm talking about, for the small state side, a neutral country like Malta doesn't engage in military operations of the type we think about in the Ukraine context, but is very active. It has an army, and it's very active in search and rescue and working with NATO's Partnership for Peace. And so I think we see an enduring relevance of military alliances and arrangements that are not only about engaging in readiness for battles, but also undertaking many of these activities to counteract what Kofi Annan would call these problems without passports, right? Organized crime, migration, the natural disasters. So I think those remain relevant to the existing organizations and will be relevant to new groupings like the Quad, which has worked on vaccine distribution against COVID-19, as well as ramping up hard security in the face of the threat of China. So I don't think one's going to replace the other. I think we're seeing a broadening of the remit and also maybe new groupings coming up as well, but not disqualifying the relevance of the older ones. What do you think?
Well, I resort to a fairly narrow definition of military alliances, in part because I worry that without such an emphasis on written treaties, for example, it becomes very difficult to draw the line between what is an alliance and what is not. And a lot of the popular discourse on security arrangements tends to blur many security relationships together as to imply some sort of false equivalency. Of course, the United States and Israel do not have a military alliance, but they're often called an alliance. And Sweden and Finland, for that matter, do enjoy fairly extensive defense cooperation with NATO members or even NATO itself, but it's not an alliance. And I don't know where I would draw the line if we start incorporating informal arrangements or alternative arrangements into the mix. And that is why I've made that decision. But I think all the same, the decision to resort to these alternative forms of security cooperation does say something about the military alliances as I define them, that the choice not to extend a formal security guarantee does say something about military alliances because it provides greater flexibility and maneuverability that is not necessarily as possible in some arrangements. And indeed, the reason why Sweden and Finland do seem to be very anxious about joining NATO right now is precisely because they do think that there is something categorically different with respect to being a formal member of a treaty-based organization than whatever it is that they have at the moment. So I think it's important to have that distinction, much like how we distinguish between marriage and other forms of romantic relationships. I think there is something categorically different, but all the same, it is part of the larger universe of cases, as it were, about security cooperation. So to answer Patrick's question directly, no, I don't think these will necessarily supplant or render obsolete military alliances in the manner that I've defined them. I think still the reason why the states decide to go about this particular vehicles of security cooperation does say something about their willingness or appetite to engage in military cooperation and how far they're willing to go. And that's why I've argued in the book that we can identify all sorts of instances where there's a shared intent to balance against adversaries or for great powers, as it were, to try to gain influence over others, but we don't actually see written-based treaty alliances. In other words, these arguments tend to overpredict. So I'm really happy that Hillary did mention all of that literature about the small states, because I really do hope to give more agency to those states that they do have benefits to procure here and that they have alternative motives at play in trying to go about these arrangements. But sometimes if they don't go about those arrangements, that still says something important about alliance politics.
Excellent, thank you. And James, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Not really. I mean, I agree with largely with what Hillary and Alexandra both said. I mean, I think that there is something that's really interesting about NATO. I mean, the same is also the case between the US and a number of its own allies, bilateral allies, particularly, for example, Japan and South Korea. And that is the extent to which the leading members within the alliance. I mean, of course, the US is the leading of the two partners between the US and Japan, or the US and South Korea. But in NATO, the US and the UK have traditionally been the leading members. So the nuclear weapon states, they have the greatest ability to project power. But what's really interesting about those alliances is, for me, not the actual treaty guarantee or of Article 5, but the fact that they've actually woven their own security into their most exposed allies. So West Germany during the Cold War, and today through the enhanced and tailored forward presences in Eastern Europe. So to the extent that, you know, the border of Britain is no longer really the English Channel, it's now the Narva River, because the UK has military forces forwardly deployed in quite significant numbers in Estonia. And the idea behind that is that the Russians understand full well that if they attack Estonia, they won't just be attacking Estonia, they'll be attacking British forces, and therefore the risk of escalation then ensues all the way to the nuclear level. And that is central to the NATO, to NATO as an alliance. And I think that's what makes NATO, you know, to some extent fundamentally different from alliances that have gone before, with the exception perhaps of those bilateral alliances that the US has in the Indo-Pacific. And that's really, really important, I think, and should be put to the center of the discussion. And in that context, the plurilateral arrangements, although important, can't reproduce or replicate that in that NATO context.
I just want to add one quick thing here before we go on to the next question. A lot of scholars ask why there's no NATO in Asia, as if that's the main puzzle. I think the actual puzzle is, why is there NATO in Europe, quite frankly? Because what is actually the matrix of security partnerships in East Asia actually fits more with the historical norm than not. NATO is the historical exception, precisely because of the breadth and depth of security cooperation that we see there. East Asia, with its patchwork of plurilateral and bilateral arrangements, looks a lot like Europe prior to 1914. It's the norm.
Thank you. Yes, that was a very interesting add on there at the end, Alex. I would, before I ask the next question, I'd just like to remind everyone asking questions to state their name and affiliation. So following on, we have Thomas Schlon, apologies if I pronounced that wrong, former director of NATO Moscow Information Office. He asks, what do the speakers expect from NATO's new strategic concept to be adopted at the Madrid summit at the end of June this year?
It's probably the worst time to write strategic concept. I think there'll be a lot more on Russia than perhaps anticipated, precisely because of the war. And I think obviously there'll be a lot more on China because of the bipartisan consensus. It's like the only source of bipartisan consensus right now in the United States that China is a problem that requires a holistic approach. I suspect there'll be more on climate change. I think some of the language of the last strategic concept is still valid because it was written in such a way as to leave some ambiguity and some future proofing. But I do think that there will obviously be much more on China, much more on Russia, much more on climate change, and perhaps some more on the resiliency of democratic societies, precisely because of some of the politics that we've seen in the last 10 years. But this is probably not the best time at all to write a strategic concept, in the most profound crisis that we've seen in Europe. But be that as it may, it has to be written.
I think Dr. Lanoszka covered all the priorities. So the only two things of that is, I think it would be interesting to see how they balance ambition with pragmatism again, but considering that we've just seen 2 years of COVID, you know, it will be interesting to see how attainable the goals are in terms of defense spending and budgets. And the other thing is, I'm personally quite curious to see whether those members of NATO who are also EU members, whether the experience of going through the strategic compass exercise over the past 2 years has led to a more coordinated approach from these countries, whether it's helped them to see where their shared approaches lie. So I do think it's good. Yeah, the timing is tough, but maybe because when you think we've had crisis after crisis, there's never a right time. I just think it's good to be engaging in these kinds of exercises.
James, anything to add there?
No, I mean, I think Alex and Hillary have given a good overview. I mean, I think the real central thing will be about how to what extent are the tailored and enhanced forward presences suitable for the task. Now, we might have looked at this rather differently if we were asking the same question a few weeks ago when Russia reinitiated its invasion of Ukraine. But it might look rather different in another couple of months. So I think Alex is absolutely right to say that we need to focus on what's actually what's happening in Ukraine, how Russia is performing, and that should then determine to what extent we actually reinforce those two flanks. More importantly, I suppose, ensure that potential new members, whether it's Finland and Sweden, or even maybe in the future Ukraine and Georgia, are drawn into the alliance. And I think actually, although some would say it's unhelpful, I think there's actually a broader discussion to be had here about how desirable it is to bring other countries into the alliance, particularly given what's happened in Ukraine. And I mean that not so much as to say that we should not allow countries like Ukraine into the alliance, but rather it actually makes sense to bring them into the alliance, because what's happening to Ukraine at this moment is the consequence of a failure to enlarge the alliance and close off the gaps that exist between Russia and the alliance. And I think that's something that needs to be given some serious thought and consideration.
Thank you, James. Moving on to the next question, which is from Richard Payne at the Council on Geostrategy. This one is for Hillary, but I'm sure anyone can answer this. How are small states in the Indo-Pacific reacting to the rise of China, and what form is alliance sheltering taking in the region?
That's such a massive question. So the challenge is, what will I prioritize to answer quick? I'll try to give you sort of the quick pitch. I think a lot of states in the region don't want to be caught in the midst of geopolitical competition. They don't want to have to choose. If you look in 2019 at the opening of the Shangri-La Dialogue, Asia's premier defense summit, you had Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore saying, everyone's asking us, are you my friend? Are you not my friend? And we say, we have many friends, and that's the way the world has to be. So you see very much a rhetoric of them not wanting to be squeezed, not wanting to choose. With some exceptions, if you're following the news at the moment, you can see that the Solomon Islands have been striking deals with China, because sometimes in the midst of geopolitical competition, it can be quite lucrative for small states in the middle. And you can see many examples of this in the Cold War, where Russia and the US were building dams and steelworks and all sorts of nice things for the states in the middle to gain their support. In terms of organizationally, I think many states want to work through ASEAN, but there is much less alignment of approach in ASEAN than you'd see in something like NATO or the EU. So there are different conflicting approaches there. Many states are looking to Indonesia to lead, but it's still there's still division between the approaches. Even how to define the Indo-Pacific is not something that's even agreed on in the region. And finally, the last maybe two examples I'll give is some states are using it as a way to serve their own ends. So I'll give you the example of Timor-Leste, that actually was engaged in a conflict, diplomatic spat over energy fields with Australia, and actually weaponized Australia's rules-based order rhetoric against it. It said, you're telling China it needs to follow the rule-based order, but you won't negotiate maritime boundaries with us. And it actually brought Australia to the table. So we can see that state, that if we in the West we're putting forward a certain rhetoric, then behavior needs to follow. So that's another area where we're seeing small states are kind of navigating the insecurity to serve their own ends. And then there are states that just don't care about, I wouldn't say they don't care, but have more important priorities. So you have countries like Kiribati are up at the UN saying, we're basically sinking. We need to map our islands because we're going to lose our exclusive economic zones as a result of climate change. And these are the issues we should be thinking about, and not what's going on between great powers fighting over influence. So it's a real mixed bag. And I know that wasn't all about military alliances, but I think though just sharing a bit of the priorities and what states are doing there gives a bit of an idea of where, if you want to bring them into a military alliance or engage with them, where their priorities might lie at the moment. And I think you're more likely to get them to speak to you about tackling organized crime, IIU, phishing, and these kinds of issues than about, are we going to go and protect Taiwan if something happens? I don't think that's the most important concern for some of these states. That was a whistle stop. There's a lot to say, so I hope that was something.
No, I think that was very substantial and agreeable. Dr. Lanoszka and James, if you don't have anything large to add to that, we can move on to another question, just so we can fit it in. This one is from Bart Brown of Strategy and Future in Poland. He says, there are many security importers and exporters. Smaller states import security from the larger ones. The UK is a classic exporter. And he's wondering which category Sweden and Finland will fall into, an importer or an exporter.
I can give a short reply, I promise, to this one, and then I'll pass to Alex or James. But I'll just say it depends how you interpret or define the forms of security that are being exported or imported. Like, is it just about who has the higher defense budget? Or what about the capacity of countries like Israel and Finland that you mentioned to provide public-private partnerships in the development of an alternative to Huawei in the middle of this 5G competition? What about access and knowledge of the Arctic? Like, there are benefits that you can import that are not necessarily, and that was my whole point in my third comment on the book at the beginning, that it's not just about numbers on the defense spending that relates to security that they are going to contribute to the alliance.
I think they'll provide marginal benefits. And when I say marginal, I mean the economic sense, not in the sense that the benefits will be small. I think Finland does have fairly impressive denial capabilities, all things considered. And I don't say that because of the experience of the Winter War. I say that because of what they have in terms of long-range fires and so forth. I think their inclusion in the alliance creates a number of problems for Russia, not the least involve targeting. So I don't see them necessarily having to import security from other countries in order to bolster their own sense of security. I think Finland, by way of getting into NATO, seeks to have more regular access to the North Atlantic Council, to have the benefits of an Article 5 commitment. However, that might be unnecessary or insufficient for actually getting military support in wartime, as well as to get other access to some goodies that NATO membership does provide. And the same, of course, goes for Sweden. So, which has the benefit of some defensive depth because it's not directly adjacent to Russia in the same way as Finland is. So I don't see them as necessarily being security importers. They might not necessarily be security exporters, but I think their presence in the alliance would be of general benefit to it.
Yeah, I broadly concur with that, but I do think that there is this issue that brings us back to 2014, when all allies agreed by 2024 to increase their defense spending closer to 2% of GDP, and then to spend 20% of that on effectively military modernization, new equipment. And I think it's really important that any new ally does actually commit to that as well, to show that they take the alliance seriously and their obligations to the alliance seriously, and that it's not only a means to shelter or a means to shelter under. So if they do that, and given the capabilities they bring, their location in terms of their geostrategic prominence, and particularly, I suppose, for Finland, because it's got a total defence concept. This would actually be a net benefit for the alliance, and if they actually play their cards right and fulfil those commitments that the other allies made, then actually they would add quite a lot to the alliance and strengthen its northeastern flank substantially. And in that sense, it's would be a very advantageous thing.
Excellent. So it is 3 minutes to 7, so we will wrap up there so we don't go over time. I would like to sincerely thank you all, our panelists and the audience, and I do hope that you enjoyed the event. Our events program is now in full swing, and we'll be bringing you many more timely and important discussions on geostrategic challenges and environmental security matters. You can check the upcoming events on our website, www.geostrategy.org.uk/events, and you can subscribe to our events on www.geostrategy.org.uk/subscribe. I would also like to say that we'll be sending a discount code for Dr. Lanoszka's book to everyone who attended the event today, so you can purchase this great book at a reduced price. Thank you all very much, and I will see you next time.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.